and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Coming up on today's verdict, we honor Women's History Month with a look back at legislation that has affected the role of women in our society. In addition, we will debate our country's national health care, specifically how has the reform to our system affected a woman's right to affordable coverage. As you can see, we have a lot to get to, so stay right here because today's verdict starts right now. Welcome to today's verdict, the show that gives you your legal rights and options. I'm your host and trial attorney for the next 30 minutes, David Lesch. The month of March has been declared Women's History Month. The movement is worldwide, with its roots extending to the first International Women's Day in 1911. Throughout the month, there is global recognition of the contributions that women have made in history and contemporary society. An example of such an event was the earning by women of the right to vote. It is probably the single most important right given to women in our country. Let's take a look back at that important legislation.
This is the story of our mothers and grandmothers who fought to vote only 90 years ago. The fact is, it wasn't until 1920 that women gained the right to go to the polls and vote, after a difficult and hard-fought battle. They wanted their voices to be heard, and on November 15, 1917, a brave group of innocent and defenseless women picketed the White House carrying signs asking for the vote. But by the end of the night, they were arrested and jailed, and eventually transferred to an abandoned workhouse located in Virginia, where many would barely survive. What unfolded is called the Night of Terror, when the warden at the workhouse ordered his guards to teach a lesson to the suffragists imprisoned there, because they dared to picket Woodrow Wilson's White House for the right to vote. 40 prison guards wielding clubs and their warden's blessing went on a rampage against the 33 women charged with obstructing sidewalk traffic. They beat Lucy Burns. They chained her hands to the cell bars above her head and left her hanging for the night, bleeding and gasping for air. They hurled Dora Lewis into a dark cell, smashed her head against an iron bed, and knocked her out cold. Her cellmate, Alice Kosu, thought Lewis was dead from a heart attack. For many weeks, the women's only water came from an open pail. Their food, all of it colorless slop, was infested with worms. Additional affidavits describe the guards grabbing, dragging, beating, choking, slamming, pinching, twisting, and kicking the women. When one of the leaders, Alice Paul, embarked on a hunger strike, they tied her to a chair, forced a tube down her throat, and poured liquid into her until she vomited. She was tortured like this for weeks until word was smuggled out to the press. Woodrow Wilson and his cronies tried to persuade a psychiatrist to declare Alice Paul insane so she could be permanently institutionalized. The doctor refused. Alice Paul was strong, he said, and brave. That didn't make her crazy. The doctor admonished the men. Courage in women is often mistaken for insanity, he said. This is a real depiction of the battle these women waged so that other women can pull the curtain at the polling booth and have their say. What would those women think of the female voting record now? If you think that voting is more of a burden than a privilege, if you think it's too much trouble and you don't have time, if you think that someone else should make your choices for you, maybe you should look these women in the eyes and tell them why.
Joining us in studio to help us break down the present power of women in the voting booth is Associate Professor of Law from St. John's University School of Law, Janai Nelson. Professor Nelson is also the Associate Director of the Ronald H. Brown Center for Civil Rights and Economic Development at St. John's. Professor, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's very powerful stuff to watch that and to see what these women went through to give us, or to give women, the right to vote. But it does seem that sometimes women take it for granted and don't even show up at the booths. And you could see from that they really went through so much.
Oh yes, the history for women to achieve the right to vote is filled with violence. It's filled with a lot of courageous women who fought and put their lives on the line to obtain this right. The interesting thing is that women actually today are turning out at higher rates than men. If we look at the rates from the last presidential election, right, in November 2012, women outperformed men in terms of their turnout. But I would say that as a whole, society doesn't necessarily embrace the right to vote as strongly as it should. Our turnout is certainly less than it should be.
Let's look at a historical going back, a historical perspective on this. It looks like, the founding fathers didn't necessarily say women cannot vote, but they obviously did not want women voting, almost treating women as property. Why did it take so long? What was going on in contemporary society that prevented men from wanting to give this right to their spouses, to their daughters?
It's a great question. In fact, there were so many myths about how women would vote if they were given the right to vote. And that was a big concern, that it would enable men to manipulate the minds of women and they would vote in the same way as their husbands, that it would bring women away from their households, that they would no longer engage in child rearing, that they might be subject to manipulation by outsiders. And there was a lot of underestimation of women's intellect at the end of the day.
It's funny, I'm looking at some of the quotes that had gone on during the debating of whether or not women should be given the right to vote in our society. One was that men could never resist the blandishments of women, and that basically government would be taken over by females. I think men were just afraid that they would lose the power that they had over women, and obviously that's something that took a very long time to get past. From a constitutional standpoint here, it looks like none of our amendments really gave women the right before. You couldn't say the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment. They never really gave women any of the rights that they needed to get to this point. Am I correct?
Well, one could argue that the 14th Amendment could have been used to try to get women the right to vote. The 14th Amendment, as we all know, requires that the laws are applied equally to all citizens of the United States. But there was still a great deal of resistance for many groups getting the right to vote. It took an additional amendment for African Americans to be able to vote, and that was in 1870, the 15th Amendment. And it wasn't until 1920 that the 19th Amendment was passed that allowed women to vote. And in the interim, there were cases brought to the Supreme Court, one famous case, Minor versus Happersett, where the Supreme Court said, yes, women are citizens, but the fact that they are citizens doesn't confer a right to vote. And that was a real blow to the women's movement.
Now, did women want to vote? Because some of the material that I've been reading suggested that, there were some women that didn't really want to or were afraid to. Why was that?
Well, certainly if you think about the time and you think of the rhetoric, some of which you just read, a lot of women did subscribe to those ideas, but there was a really significant movement among women to get the right to vote. Certainly there were divisions, and in fact, after women were granted the right to vote, many did not actually turn out to the polls in the 1920s and 30s to exercise that right. It really required a cultural shift and a mental shift for women to exercise that right.
Well, what do you think the tipping point was? What do you think made women finally understand, hey, look, I have the right to do this now. I want to do this. Was it wars, the world wars that came? What made women decide to go out there and exercise their right?
Well, I think it's something that developed over time, and certainly men being called off to warfare and women having to take charge of the homestead and recognize that with additional education, I think educational opportunities opened up for women, and they began to realize that by exercising the right to vote, they could become a more powerful voice in society.
Let's fast forward to today. Women, we had talked a little bit about that. They are voting, not as many as we'd like, but we're never happy with how many people actually get into the voting booths. What are we doing to try and encourage women to get in there and make sure that their voice is heard? Are we doing anything? Or is there any type of platform that's being put forth on either the television or anywhere else?
Well, I think the excerpt that you showed at the beginning of this show is a powerful image to encourage young women to try to come out to vote. I think many of us don't really understand the history and what it took to get this right. And we have to ask the question, if women were willing to die for this right, it must be a pretty powerful one that we ought to exercise.
Very interesting. I read something about Ann Coulter, who wanted to take the rights of voting for women away because she necessarily didn't like the way the women are voting. I guess they're voting as a bloc more often than not on the Democratic ticket as opposed to the Republican ticket. And when asked why, she argued that if every election since 1950, aside from the 1964 Barry Goldwater election, they would have been won by Republicans had it not been for the women vote. So there are some women out there who feel, or some men also, who feel that women are just voting as a bloc and they're preventing, I don't know, another group, like the Republican Party, from growing. How would you answer that particular
Well,
charge?
I think that's a testament to the power of women voting, that in fact, if women band together and vote in blocks or vote toward their social interests, that they can affect the outcome of elections. I think, in fact, that's a case and an argument for expanding the franchise for women and certainly not for taking it away.
And it's certainly, an argument can be made that there are people out there that are still preventing women from really exercising their right. And it's something that I certainly want you to come back on the show to discuss with us.
I'd be happy to do that.
All right. We have to take a quick break, but when we return, we will discuss healthcare reform and women's rights. We'll be right back.
Did you find the flashlight and the batteries?
Yes.
Did you make sure we're not missing anything in the first aid kit?
Yep.
Did you go through the plan with the kids again?
Yes. The more you prepare today, the more you'll be able to reduce the devastating effects of a tornado, an earthquake, a power outage, or any other disaster.
Welcome back. I'm your host, David Lesch. Our show is dedicated to you, our viewers, and we are here to answer your legal questions. So if there is a topic or question you'd like us to cover, let us know on Facebook at facebook.com/today'sverdict or tweet us at Today's Verdict. Today's show has been dedicated to discussing historical legislation that has opened doors for women in the United States. As a society, it is clear that although we have come a long way, there is still work ahead. Our government has put women's health care high on the health care reform agenda. Let's take a look back at what strides the Obama administration has made in dealing with women's health, specifically a woman's right to safe and affordable care during the reproductive years. Let's see what President Obama has planned.
As part of the health care reform law that I signed last year, all insurance plans are required to cover preventive care at no cost. That means free checkups, free mammograms, immunizations, and other basic services. We fought for this because it saves lives and it saves money for families, for businesses, for government, for everybody. And that's because it's a lot cheaper to prevent an illness than to treat one. We also accepted a recommendation from the experts at the Institute of Medicine that when it comes to women, preventive care should include coverage of contraceptive services such as birth control. In addition to family planning, Doctors often prescribe contraception as a way to reduce the risks of ovarian and other cancers and treat a variety of different ailments. And we know that the overall cost of health care is lower when women have access to contraceptive services. Nearly 99% of all women have relied on contraception at some point in their lives. 99%. And yet more than half of all women between the ages of 18 and 34 have struggled to afford it. So for all these reasons, we decided to follow the judgment of the nation's leading medical experts and make sure that free preventive care includes access to free contraceptive care. Whether you're a teacher or a small businesswoman or a nurse or a janitor, no woman's health should depend on who she is or where she works or how much money she makes. Every woman should be in control of the decisions that affect her own health, period. Under the rule, women will still have access to free preventive care that includes contraceptive services, no matter where they work. So that core principle remains. But if a woman's employer is a charity or a hospital that has a religious objection to providing contraceptive services as part of their health plan, the insurance company, not the hospital, not the charity, will be required to reach out and offer the woman contraceptive care free of charge, without copays and without hassles. The result will be that religious organizations won't have to pay for these services, and no religious institution will have to provide these services directly. Let me repeat, these employers will not have to pay for or provide contraceptive services. But women who work at these institutions will have access to free contraceptive services just like other women. And they'll no longer have to pay hundreds of dollars a year that could go towards paying the rent or...
Joining us today to share her expertise on women's rights, specifically how they might be impacted by healthcare reform, is Professor of Law at the City University School of Law, Caitlin Borgman. Professor, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It just seems like a no-brainer here. I mean, 99% of women at some point have used contraception. Why? What's the backlash? What is preventing us from making sure that women can get contraceptives and or products, whatever they need, without having to pay for it? I don't understand. What's the backlash there?
Yeah, it is really hard to explain. I mean, particularly since conservative Republicans don't want women to get abortions either, right? So you would think that they would think that preventing unintended pregnancy would be really worthwhile. And also, as your clip showed, and as you just mentioned, it saves costs for employers and for women and families, and it's just good for society.
I mean, it's preventative. It really does. I mean, it's preventing cancers. It's making sure that women are not having unwanted pregnancies and health issues regarding that. So you almost wonder what's taking so long. But as you mentioned, there is a religious backlash to it. Let's talk a little bit about the act itself. What's in there?
So the act provides for all kinds of preventive health services for women that they can now obtain without paying a copay. So and it covers a huge range of health services, but even just within reproductive health services, it covers mammograms and pap smears and access to contraception. It covers, if they do have a baby, it covers maternity care and well baby and well child care. So there's a huge range of preventive services that are covered for women that hopefully will allow them to have healthier pregnancies and healthier childbirth, and then also miss less work, because women often have to miss work if their child is sick.
Well, what had been done in the past? Let's say you're an average Bronxite, you're watching the show. If you're a woman, what would you have to do if you needed to take care of a situation, to get contraception or maybe have an abortion? What would you have to do?
Well, it totally depended on a woman's insurance plan, right? So assuming she had insurance, then it would depend on what the coverage was. And one of the things that the Affordable Care Act does is prevent discrimination in insurance rates for women. So a lot of insurance companies charged higher premiums for women, not for any good sort of demographic reason, but they did. So women ended up paying more for their health insurance, and a lot of the services weren't fully covered. So, for example, they may have some coverage of contraception, but the plan might not cover all FDA-approved methods, for example. So they were just completely at the mercy of whatever their particular plan was. Also, because women tend to have less steady employment, they might be more subject to losing their plan if they lose their job, for example, or if they're dependent on their spouse's plan and then they have a divorce. So this ensures that women will have coverage no matter what.
Now, this is a federal act, obviously.
That's right.
Let's talk about what's going on with the states. Now, are the states in line or not in line? Let's not forget about New York for a second. We'll get there. Let's just talk about nationally.
It depends very much, right? It's a total patchwork. So some states had already passed contraceptive mandates at the state level. Many states actually had. But then there are states that are resisting, and some states are wanting to prevent insurance plans within the exchanges from doing certain things. We have individual lawsuits that are being brought by religiously affiliated employers, but also secular, non-religious employers like Tom Monahan of Domino's Pizza fame.
Yeah, what's his beef? I don't really understand that.
He claims to have a religious objection to covering contraceptives. He doesn't want to pay for it in women's health care plans. But, the irony about that is that if an employer, so as President Obama mentioned, 99% of women are going to access contraceptives, right? And if their insurance doesn't cover it, they're going to pay out of pocket for it. So either way, right, they're either going to pay with the paycheck that they get from him, or they're going to do it through an insurance plan.
Exactly.
It's really, the argument doesn't make any sense. It's just sort of this political argument that gets made, and it's particularly offensive when it's made by employers who, are just basing it on their own private
Well, I guess
views.
they're being funded by certain religious institutions as well, so it could be a monetary thing. It's not just, their own way of thinking themselves. But let's talk a little bit about where we are in the legal system with respect to the act. Are there legal challenges that are now in the circuit court? How high are we at this point?
Right. So of course, last year we had a challenge to the constitutionality of the act as a whole, right? And that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the act last summer. So the act has been held constitutional in terms of Congress having power to have enacted this piece of legislation. But what we're seeing now are these individual lawsuits, like I mentioned, by insurance, among other lawsuits. We're seeing these employers who are suing to say that they should have an exemption. There is a religious exemption in the law.
We heard it.
Right. But they are looking, they don't fit under the exemption, so they're suing to have an exemption mandated by courts. And we have a lot of federal challenges, many pending in the federal courts, in the federal trial courts, and in the federal appeals courts. And there are decisions going both ways, so it seems quite likely that it will end up in the Supreme
we're going to talk
Court.
about New York in a second, but we have to take a quick break. But coming up, we will continue the discussion on women and their reproductive rights. We'll be right back.
Low-fat cheese sandwiches on whole wheat bread. Chewy and good for you. Snacks high in calcium help build strong bones, and foods rich in fiber are good for your heart. So you have the power to dominate. Can your food do that? Run, throw, think, eat better. Find out more at smallstep.gov.
Welcome back. I'm your host, David Lesch. Remember that our show is here to serve you, our viewers. So don't forget to connect with us on Facebook at facebook.com/today'sverdict and on Twitter at Today's Verdict. And tell us what topics or questions you'd like us to cover on the show. The topic of discussion has been women's rights and the Health Care Reform Act. We've been looking at how the act can affect women across our nation. Joining us today on today's show is Professor of Law from the City University of New York, Caitlin Borgman. Professor, again, thanks for being with us. Let's get into New York now. What's going on the state level here? I would assume we're one of the more liberal states. Is that true? Is it not?
Yes. So New York doesn't have a lot of the extreme legislation that's going on in a lot of states. We've seen some of these states passing abortion bans as early as 6 weeks, as of last week, North Dakota. So So New York doesn't have those kinds of pieces of legislation to deal with. So women are in a relatively good place in New York compared with other states. One thing that I think is interesting to note is that New York is a state that passed its own state-level contraceptive coverage mandate for insurance companies.
And when was that?
When was that?
Yeah.
Late 1990s or maybe.
Okay, so we were ahead of the curve. But we
were ahead of the curve.
We tend to be ahead of the curve.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, New York had a religious exemption that was narrowly covered certain kinds of religious employers, which was actually the same language that was originally included in the Federal Health Care Act. So New York provided a good model for that aspect of the Affordable Care Act. One thing that's exciting that's going on right now in New York is that Governor Cuomo has supported legislation called the New York Reproductive Health Act, which would provide for, which would establish an affirmative right on women's behalf to make reproductive health decisions, including contraception or abortion. And then it implements particularly reforms for abortion law in New York.
What types of reforms?
So, for example, in New York, the abortion provisions are all in the penal code. And this law would move them into the Public Health Act, which is really where abortion regulation should belong, along with regulation of other medical procedures. It would also, New York actually has, it was considered an early sort of reform law in the days before Roe versus Wade, which established, of course, the constitutional right to an abortion. But it's become sort of outdated in light of Roe v. Wade and other Supreme Court decisions. So, for example, it bans abortions starting at 24 weeks of pregnancy. Doesn't matter if the fetus is viable. So, for example, if the fetus couldn't live anyway, its brain hasn't developed, the woman still can't get an abortion if the 24-week mark has passed under New York law. That's not constitutional, so this would update the law to make it more constitutional. It also doesn't allow women to get abortions for health purposes throughout pregnancy. So this would provide for that as well.
One last question for you. Where are we heading as a society with respect to this type of legislation? Are we going to give women more rights, or do you think we're going to take a scale back? Where do you think we're heading?
You know, I think that it's very discouraging to look at some of the conservative states and what they're doing. But I also think that you were talking in the earlier segment about women's voting power. I think that women really showed in the last election that their reproductive health care is really important to them, and that they're willing to cast their votes accordingly. And I think that the Republican Party has made terrible mistakes in terms of how it talks about women and rape and women's need for basic health care services like contraception, attacking Planned Parenthood, which is this provider of basic health care for women. And so I think that right now we're in a position where I think the Republicans are on the defensive, and I think that's good. I hope we can take advantage of it.
Well, I hope you're right. Okay, you come back and maybe we could talk about it.
Thank you. I'd love to.
All right. Well, that's all for tonight. It's time to deliberate. I'd like to thank both of our guests for joining us, and of course you for watching. Remember, if there is a legal issue or topic you would like to see on the show, email me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org. And until we see you again, always remember, know your rights, know your issues, reach a verdict. We'll see you next time.